Chapter 1. Before the Rain Fell. In the beginning there was stillness, not the stillness of emptiness, but the kind that hums with life. The earth was young, untouched, a canvas brushed with the fingerprints of God. He had formed it, not with haste, but with holiness. Light was spoken into being, not forced. Waters were divided with care. The stars above were not scattered, they were placed one by one like lanterns hung in a velvet sky. Beneath that sacred sky was a world blooming with peace. The rivers flowed not in haste but in praise, singing soft songs as they moved through the garden valleys. Mountains stood as silent sentinels, not looming with threat, but resting with purpose. Every bird that flew, every deer that leapt, and every petal that opened did so without fear. There was no death, no shadows clung to the corners of creation, and in that perfect world walked mankind. Formed from dust yet filled with breath, divine breath, man and woman were not merely made, they were beloved. God walked with them, not as a distant ruler, but as a friend in the cool of the day. Their hearts were unburdened, their hands were clean, and their minds held only light. Work was a joy, rest was a blessing, love was pure, unscarred by pride or selfishness. But even in paradise a whisper stirred. In the shade of beauty grew a choice, a test not of strength, but of trust. And with one act of defiance the door was opened. Sin, like a shadow cast by a single candle, slipped in. It began softly, almost invisibly. A word unkind, a thought concealed, a desire unchecked. What had once been one heartbeat with the Creator now carried the echo of separation. Still God did not leave. His love lingered, covering shame with grace, giving time, always giving time, yet paradise would not remain untouched. With the passing of days, the echo of that first fall grew louder. The world was still beautiful, yes, but no longer innocent. The turning of hearts. As generations passed, the gentle heartbeat of humanity began to change. What was once a song of communion with God became a noise, a dissonance of pride, power, and pain. The children of the earth forgot their beginnings. The stories of Eden faded like mist. The sacred became distant, and the voice of God, once a constant companion, became a whisper, drowned out by the cries of ambition. Men no longer tilled the earth in joy, they conquered it in greed. Cities rose not to honor the heavens, but to glorify man, with stone and iron. They built towers that reached high, but hearts that reached low. Violence became a familiar sound, the clash of sword, the scream of betrayal. The land soaked in the blood of brothers. Lies passed from father to son like inheritance. Justice was silenced by fear. The weak were forgotten, the poor were mocked. What once had been a people shaped in the image of God had now begun to shape gods in their own image, gods of wrath, gods of lust, gods of gold. The Creator looked upon his world, not with surprise, for he sees all, but with sorrow. He saw the hearts of men had turned inward, cold and hollow. They had abandoned the light. The earth, once filled with praise, now echoed with pain. The skies that had once carried only birdsong now bore witness to cries for vengeance. And yet, still, the mercy of God waited. He did not rush to judge. He watched, longing for return, for repentance, for one soul to pause and remember Eden. But the world moved on, further and further from the gentle garden, and closer toward its own undoing. The grief of heaven in the throne room of heaven beyond the stars and above all time, God watched, not with rage, but with grief too deep for human words. For every life that turned from him, every heart that hardened, every child that suffered beneath the weight of sin, he felt. Not distantly, not coldly, but with the tenderness of a father whose children no longer know his name. The Holy One is not swift to wrath. His justice is not impatient. His anger is not like man's. It is not impulsive, not born of pride. It is the fire of holiness, kindled only when mercy has been rejected beyond return. He looked upon the world he had made, the rivers now polluted, the cities filled with blood, the children taught to hate before they could walk. And his heart broke. And so, in sorrowful mercy, he decided. Not all would be lost, but the earth would be cleansed. The flood would not come as a cruel surprise, but as a slow and sacred washing, a divine reset. But it was not spoken in haste. In the silence of heaven, the plan was not shouted. It was whispered, like a sigh, like a tear, falling unseen. God would send a storm, yes, but he would also send a way of escape. For though the world had turned its face, God had not turned his. Though men had forgotten their Maker, the Maker had remembered his promise to preserve, to redeem, to restore. So the winds of heaven shifted. The angels, still in awe of God's patience, waited. The stars above burned a little brighter, sensing the gravity of what was coming. It was the beginning of an ending, but also the beginning of a beginning. A man set apart. And in the midst of the darkened earth, among the clamor and cruelty, there was a man. He was not loud, he was not mighty by the world's measure, but his soul was quiet, his heart open. His name was Noah. Noah walked differently. While others ran to violence, he chose peace. While the crowds laughed at the sacred, he listened. He tended his land not with greed, but with reverence. His hands were weathered, not from building empires, but from humble labor. His eyes, though worn by time, held the glint of faith. Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord, not because he was perfect, but because he was willing. While others turned away, he looked up. While others forgot, he remembered. In a world that had closed its ears to heaven, Noah still heard. And in the quiet of his spirit, God spoke. It was not a thunderous call, it was a whisper. Clear and unmistakable, God shared his sorrow with Noah. He revealed what would come, not to frighten, but to prepare. A flood, vast and holy, would wash the earth. But Noah, obedient and faithful, would build an ark, a vessel of salvation, not just for him, but for life itself. And so the journey began. Not with a storm, not with panic, but with faith. One man, one whisper, one promise. Amid the coming rain, a covenant was born. And though the skies were still clear and the ground still dry, something had already begun to shift. The rain had not yet fallen, but heaven had already moved. Chapter 2. The Voice in the Morning. Before the world awoke in its fullness, before the sound of man's labor or beast's call filled the air, Noah rose. Each day began not with noise, but with reverence. The sky was still a soft shade of indigo, the earth draped in dew like a prayer in silence. In those sacred hours, when the breath of the world was gentle, Noah stepped out from his tent and knelt on the soil. He did not speak at first. He simply waited. There, in the hush of creation, a whisper stirred. It was not a sound one could hear with the ears. It was a presence, deep, calm, and eternal. The wind moved softly among the trees, and in it, Noah sensed the weight of eternity pressing gently upon his spirit. He did not fear this voice, for it was not the voice of wrath. It was the voice of the one who made all things, steady, sure, and full of quiet purpose. Noah listened, not with doubt, but with a heart made still by faith. His soul had been attuned to the sacred frequency of heaven. While the world chased pleasures and turned away, Noah turned toward. In stillness, he waited, and the Lord spoke, not with thunder, not with blazing fire, but with the softness of breath. Like a father speaking to his child, the Creator shared his heart. Every morning, Noah returned to this place. The stones beneath his knees knew his prayers. The wind had carried his many silences. And in that daily communion, a holy friendship grew. God did not need to shout to reach Noah, for Noah had learned the power of listening. In that quiet faithfulness, the foundations of the ark were already being formed, not yet with timber, but with trust. A divine blueprint. Then came a morning like all others, and yet unlike any before. The stillness was just as profound. The hush of dawn lingered like a veil. But this time, the voice did not wait. It came clearly, directly, with purpose woven into every syllable. Noah bowed lower, the dust of the earth rising gently beneath him. As the message settled over his soul, the Lord began to reveal a vision, not in dreams, not in riddles, but in the clarity of divine command. "Make for yourself an ark," the voice whispered, "not a vessel for war or speed, but a sacred house that would float upon the deep." The instructions were not vague or hurried. They were detailed, precise, 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. 3 levels, a single door, a window placed near the top. All to be built of cypress wood and sealed with pitch, both inside and out. This was no ordinary task. This was not the work of invention or imagination. This was the echo of heaven's own wisdom taking shape on earth. Every cubit, every beam, every sealed edge carried with it the fingerprints of divine foresight. God was not merely instructing Noah to build a boat. He was inviting him into a partnership, into a holy act of preservation. Noah's heart did not tremble at the size of the task, nor did his hands falter at the scale of the command. He did not question the voice that had become his morning companion. He simply received the blueprint as sacred. Every instruction was a piece of divine speech. The ark would be a sanctuary, a cradle for life amid judgment, and Noah would be its steward. As the sun slowly climbed and light touched the edges of the earth, Noah remained still, the vision seared into his mind. He saw the ark not yet in timber, but as a covenant of trust between him and the Eternal One. The plans were not just architectural, they were spiritual. A house of wood, yes, but also a shelter of mercy. A promise and a warning in the stillness that followed the vision. The Lord spoke once more, not of measurements but of meaning. The voice, still calm, carried now a deeper weight. "I will send the waters," the Lord said. "A flood shall cover the earth." These words fell not like stones but like rain, soft at first, but with the heaviness of coming judgment. Noah felt no panic, though sorrow welled quietly within him. He knew the world had turned far from its maker. Violence and pride had become like breath to the people, and goodness was rare. Yet this was not a message of destruction alone. It was also a declaration of mercy, for though the earth would be washed clean, not all would be lost. Life would be preserved through him. A promise was spoken, shaped like a covenant. "With you," said the Lord, "I will establish my covenant." These were words of shelter in the storm, a bond made not of stone or scroll, but of divine intention. Noah, though but one man, had been chosen to carry the seed of new beginnings. He would bring into the ark his wife, his sons, and their wives. He would gather animals, 2 of every kind, male and female, to keep alive the breath of creation. The message was clear: build, prepare, trust. The flood would come. The skies would open, the deep would rise. But there was time, and there was a plan. The world would be judged, but it would also be renewed. In this sacred balance, wrath and rescue, cleansing and covenant, Noah stood quietly, holding the weight of both in his soul. And in that morning light, beneath the whispering trees, he accepted the call. Not with loud vows, but with the silence of obedience. His life was no longer his own. It belonged to the task, to the promise, to the unseen mercy of God. Telling the family. Later that day, as the sun rested gently above the hills, and the wind still bore the scent of stillness, Noah gathered his family. His wife, long familiar with his quiet strength, sat beside him. His sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, looked on with expectant eyes. Their wives, too, gathered close, each one sensing the hush of something sacred about to unfold. Noah did not dramatize the moment. He did not raise his voice or pace the earth. He spoke as he always did, slowly, softly, and with the weight of heaven behind every word. He shared the vision, the ark, the flood, the calling. He told them of the voice in the stillness and the covenant that had been spoken. They listened, not with disbelief, but with reverence. The silence that followed his words was long, but it was not empty. It was full of awe, of questions too sacred to speak aloud, of the holy fear that comes when eternity brushes close to the world of men. His wife placed her hand upon his, not in hesitation, but in shared resolve. She had walked with Noah through years of quiet obedience, and she would walk with him into this mystery. His sons exchanged glances, their hearts stirred by both fear and faith. The world had taught them many things, but their father had taught them something stronger. How to trust the invisible, how to listen to the quiet voice of God. They did not ask for proof. They saw it in Noah's eyes. They felt it in the peace that lingered after his words. And so, without resistance, they gave their hearts to the task. They would build, they would prepare, they would believe, not because they understood everything, but because they trusted the one who listened. That evening, as the stars began to bloom above them, the family sat together in silence, not out of fear, but out of unity. The journey ahead would be long. The work would be great, but their hearts were set. A new chapter in God's story had begun, and they had been chosen to carry it forward. In the gentle hush of that sacred night, they understood something deeper than words. Obedience was not a burden, but a gift, and faith, like the ark to come, would carry them through the storm. Chapter 3. Gathering the Trees. In the hush of early morning, before the mist had fully lifted from the earth and before the birds began their song, there came a sound that had not yet been heard in the hills, an axe striking wood. It was not loud, not harsh, but steady, rhythmic, intentional. The sound echoed gently, like a voice speaking into the silence of the land. With every swing, Noah felt the weight not of labor alone, but of promise. He stood at the edge of the forest, a grove of tall cypress trees rising before him, each one chosen, each one seen. The first tree bowed slowly, as if in reverence to its purpose. With a final crack and groan, it yielded to gravity and lay upon the earth. Noah stepped back, breathing softly, his hands resting on the handle of the axe. He looked not at what he had cut down, but at what was to come. A vessel not yet formed, but fully alive in his heart. He whispered a prayer over the fallen tree, not of victory, but of gratitude. For even in this, there was sacredness. The forest was not a place of mere resources, it was a sanctuary. The trees did not fall in vain, but in offering. Their lives would cradle life. Their limbs, stripped and shaped, would hold generations to come in the belly of mercy. The wood smelled of earth and rain, rich and full. Noah's hands moved gently over the bark, reverent in touch. Each log, each beam he would draw from the forest was more than timber. It was a prayer made tangible. He did not cut with haste. He walked the woods with care, choosing each tree as if guided by the breath of the Lord. The forest, though diminished with each day, did not resist. In its quiet way, it seemed to understand. It released its giants of bark and branch, and with every fall, Noah's purpose rose. The axe sang its sacred rhythm through the air, and in that rhythm, the future took root. Strength in every grain. As the timber gathered and the clearing widened, the labor began to take form. Noah called to his sons. Together they lifted the first beams onto the ground where the ark would rise. The sun warmed their backs and the scent of sap lingered on their skin. It was in this quiet setting that Noah began to teach, not with grand speeches, but with the language of work and wood. He showed Shem how to read the grain of the wood, how to see where the tree had grown strong and where it had bent to wind. He guided Ham's hands as he shaped the beams, smoothing their edges until they joined without space or splinter. And with Japheth, he measured the length and breadth, marking each plank with a whisper of precision. This wood, Noah would say, is not only strength, it is story. The trees had stood through seasons, and now they would float above storm and sea. Every knot in the wood held a memory. Every ring within the grain bore silent witness to years that had come before. It was not perfection they sought in the wood, but unity. Each piece joining the next, not in force, but in harmony. The ark began to grow, first in breadth, then in height. It rose not swiftly, but surely, like faith itself. The sons learned to trust not only the tools in their hands, but the vision their father carried. And in the long days of sawing and fitting, of lifting and sanding, they found a rhythm, a peace. They spoke little, for the work was worship. The sound of hammering was a hymn. The scrape of tools against wood was a psalm. The ark became a song in timber, its chords shaped by obedience, its melody carried by grace. As the beams joined and the structure took shape, those who looked upon it from afar could not yet understand. But for Noah and his sons, each part of the ark spoke of something eternal. It was not a building of survival, it was a promise in wood, strong not only in form, but in faith. Quiet laughter in the distance. While the family built, the world watched, not in wonder, but in scorn. The fields nearby, once filled with wandering shepherds and children at play, now held new visitors, those drawn not by faith, but by curiosity. From the nearby towns they came, some alone, some in groups. They brought no tools, only laughter. They stood at the edges, pointing toward the structure that rose with each day. "Where is your sea, old man?" they called. "Will your ark float on dry ground?" Their voices were not filled with malice, only disbelief. To them, the work was foolishness. The sky was clear, the rivers calm, no sign of rain, no whisper of flood. And so they laughed, but Noah did not turn to answer. His hands stayed upon the beam. His eyes remained fixed on the task. The sound of hammering rose above their voices. It was louder than their doubt. It drowned their questions. Noah's sons heard the jeers. At first, they flinched. Then they glanced to their father and found in him a peace that spoke louder than any insult. They learned by watching him the sacred strength of silence. "Let them laugh," Noah had once said gently. "The work is not for them. It is for the Lord." And so they built. Day after day the crowd came and went. Some shouted. Some shook their heads. Others returned home to tell stories of the strange builder in the hills. But the ark grew still, board by board, beam by beam. The laughter remained distant, the hammering constant. In time, even the mockers grew weary. The novelty faded. They turned to other amusements, other voices. But Noah's family stayed, unmoved, unworried. They did not build to be understood. They built to be faithful. And the ark, silent but strong, stood as a testimony, not to what men could see, but to what one man had heard in the stillness. A family of builders. Together they worked, morning to night, through sweat and sore muscles, through sun and shadow. They labored as one. Noah, his wife, their sons, and their sons' wives. All hands were needed, but more than that, all hearts were joined. They did not argue over tasks. They did not count who carried more. Every hand had a purpose, every plank a place. In the white, great silence of their shared labor, something deeper was being built than the ark alone, a bond of sacred unity. Noah's wife would prepare meals in the quiet hours, bringing water to cool the heat from her son's brows. She mended garments torn by work and soothed aching hands with oils and balm. Her care was a quiet strength that kept the fire of their mission alive. The daughters-in-law, too, learned to smooth the wood, to lift beams, to hold fast what needed holding. Their laughter, light and rare, rang like soft bells between the strikes of hammer and the calls of their husbands. They were not born builders, but in this task they became more than they had imagined. At night, when the stars returned and the hills turned dark, they would sit beside the ark. Sometimes they sang, sometimes they prayed. Often they simply rested, shoulder to shoulder, soul to soul. The ark stood behind them, unfinished, yet already sheltering something precious: the unity of family under God's purpose. They did not know how long it would take. They did not know when the rains would come, but they knew why they built, not for fear, not for pride, but for love, for the animals that would be saved, for the future that would be held, for the God who had spoken. And so, plank by plank, with hands joined by purpose and hearts steady with grace, they continued. The ark rose not as a monument to man, but as a cradle of covenant. And in the slow rhythm of their sacred labor, heaven watched in silence, and the earth waited for the flood. Chapter 4. The Slow Years of Obedience. Time passed like the steady flowing of a gentle river, not rushed, not loud, but constant. The sky, always wide and blue above, remained unchanged. The sun continued to rise and set, and the stars returned, each evening in their quiet procession. And beneath that sky, in the fields now marked with timber and work, Noah's ark grew. Slowly, seasons came and went. Trees shed their leaves, and new blossoms replaced them. Children in the towns nearby grew into adults. Crops were sown, harvested, and sown again. But within Noah's household, time was measured differently, not by the rhythms of the market or the yield of the soil, but by the weight of faith. The work never ceased. One day followed another with a holy kind of repetition. There was no voice from the heavens repeating the command, no new visions to stir them forward. Only memory. Only the deep certainty of what Noah had once heard in the stillness. The ark rose not with haste, but with endurance. A beam was added here, a door carved there. 3 levels took shape like layers of prayer, built not only with wood, but with perseverance. Noah's sons had grown stronger, their hands had become steady from labor, their wives became wise in the ways of storage and preparation. Noah's wife still moved with grace, her touch both guiding and gentle, like the voice of God that had first called them. Still the sky remained blue. Still no rain. And yet the faith did not wither. The years stretched long, but they did not break the family. Instead, they became the proving ground of obedience. For faith is not forged only in signs and wonders, and it is strengthened in silence. It is the daily return to labor, even when no end is in sight. There were days when their backs ached, when the wood split wrong, when a storm passed through and undid a portion of what had been built. But even then, Noah would gather his family, remind them of the promise, and bless the work again. In these long years, faith grew deep roots. Like the trees that once stood in that place, their trust in God was planted deep within the soil of patience. And even though time flowed like a slow-moving stream, they never stopped believing that one day the waters would come. The mockers return. As the ark grew taller, so too did the curiosity of the people around them. The same fields that once held silence now drew voices again. Not voices of worship, but of ridicule. From nearby towns, people came not to help, but to laugh. They brought their children and their neighbors, treating the great wooden structure like a spectacle. Some climbed hills just to catch a glimpse of the strange creation. Others gathered in groups, pointing, whispering, laughing aloud. They called out to Noah in jest. "Have you heard thunder, old man?" they shouted. "Will the birds carry your ship to sea?" Their laughter rang out like chimes made of pride and disbelief. But Noah did not respond in anger. He never raised his voice or met their scoffing with shame. He stood steady. With weathered hands he kept building, and when the crowd pressed too near, he would gently speak. "The rain will come," he would say, soft as a shepherd. "This ark is not for me, but for mercy. There is room for those who believe." But few listened. Most turned back to their lives with mocking on their tongues and dust on their sandals. They returned to their marketplaces, to their games, to their celebrations. They trusted only what they could see. And the sky, still so blue, seemed to agree with them. Noah's sons would sometimes glance toward the crowds with questions in their eyes. But their father would gently touch their shoulders and return their gaze to the work. "Let us build," he would whisper, not to silence them, but to honor him. And so, while the world scoffed, the ark rose. The voices of mockers came and went, like the wind that stirred the grass but could not uproot the trees. And above all, Noah's steady obedience stood, a lighthouse of faith built not for applause, but for salvation. Even as clouds began to form faintly on the distant horizon, faint wisps that seemed ordinary to those who looked, the hearts of many remained dry. Their laughter persisted, but they did not see the shift beginning in the sky. Preparing for the unseen, within the ark, rooms were measured, floors were swept, walls were sealed. It was not yet filled with animals, but the shape of its purpose began to whisper. Noah and his family moved through the vessel as caretakers of something sacred, preparing not for what was seen, but for what had been spoken. Day by day, they stored provisions. Grains were dried and packed, jars were sealed with care. Olives, figs, lentils, honey. Clay vessels stood lined along the walls like sentinels of hope. Herbs were tied in bundles. Oils poured into skins. Seeds were collected, not for eating, but for planting, for someday starting again. Each room was prepared with intention. Spaces for the creatures yet to come, pens for the cattle, perches for the birds, nooks for the small things that crawl and scurry. They did not know the exact size or kind of every beast that would enter, but they prepared as if they did. Hope took the form of daily labor. There were no trumpets, no rushing signs, but every nail hammered into wood, every jar lifted, every corner swept was an act of belief. They moved not by sight, but by trust. Some days were quieter than others. The family would walk the length of the ark, checking the rooms, adjusting what needed changing. Noah would pause often, laying his hand on the walls, praying silently for what would soon come. Outside, the world continued in its rhythms, but inside the ark, something holy was being made ready. Not only a vessel, but a home. Not only a home, but a refuge. They prepared with care, not because the flood was near in time, but because the promise was sure in spirit. To work in expectation, even in silence, is to live in worship. And in every small task, the family worshipped, not with song, but with readiness. The quiet of trust. At night, when the day's work was finished and the moon rose above the hills, Noah would step outside the ark. He would sit in the grass, his back resting against a stone, and lift his eyes toward the stars. He did not ask the heavens for signs. He did not plead for thunder or a sudden storm to prove him right. He only whispered soft prayers, like breath in the darkness. Lord, your will, your time, your strength. In those silent prayers he asked not for answers, but for presence. He did not need proof. He needed only the quiet certainty that the same voice who spoke once in the stillness was still near, and the Lord answered, not with visions or signs, but with peace, a peace that settled over Noah like a cloak, a peace that reminded him that waiting is not weakness and silence is not absence. Heaven was not unaware. The angels did not sleep. The hand that had painted the stars above still held the days in its palm. And Noah, though surrounded by doubts from the world, was kept by a deeper trust, one not born from what he saw, but from the one who had spoken. His wife would sometimes join him in the stillness. Together they would sit in the quiet. No words needed, only presence. Around them, the hills whispered with wind. The trees swayed like worshippers. The ark stood behind them, massive, unfinished, but faithful. In these moments, trust was not loud. It did not leap. It did not strive. It simply rested. The long years did not break Noah. They deepened him. They became like deep waters, calm on the surface, strong underneath. And though the rains had not yet come, the flood of faith within him had already begun. He would rise each morning not with answers, but with readiness. And each night he would rest not with certainty of when, but with the assurance of who. And that quiet, that sacred quiet, was enough. Chapter 5. The animals begin to arrive. There was no sound of trumpet. No voice thundered from the heavens. There was only the gentle hush of morning, the whisper of leaves in the wind, and the faint hum of life shifting in rhythm with the unseen. Will of God, it began, slowly, a soft rustle in the trees, the flutter of wings, the faintest tremble of the ground. And then they came. From the hills and forests, from caves and deserts, the animals began to arrive, not with haste, not with confusion, but with purpose. 2 by 2 they came, male and female, moving as though drawn by a song only they could hear. Deer stepped lightly across the fields, their hooves barely bending the grass. Elephants rumbled in the distance, their slow march shaking the earth with each step. Birds filled the sky in peaceful flight, wings open wide, circling before descending in graceful spirals. Lions walked beside lambs. Wolves did not snarl. Doves flew unhindered past hawks. There was no fear among them, no chase, no scattering. Predator and prey moved as companions, drawn by a call greater than instinct, a whisper in their being, quiet but irresistible. This was not the way of the world.
They knew.
This was the way of the one who had made them. Noah stood near the ark's entrance, his hands folded before him, eyes wide, not with surprise, but with reverence. He watched as the procession grew, a living stream of flesh and feather, of scale and hoof. His sons gathered around him. Even they, who had labored for years, paused to witness what words could not contain. There was no command issued aloud.
No signal from man. And yet the creatures obeyed as if led by the very breath of God, 2 by 2, male and female, not scattered, not herded, but chosen and sent. It was not chaos, it was covenant, and so the ark opened its arms to the gathering.
Life. The first echoes of a new beginning already forming in quiet footsteps and gentle wings. The world watches. News of the procession spread quickly. Word traveled faster than the animals themselves, carried by astonished voices and eager feet. People who had mocked now watched. Some came to scoff again. Others came in silence, uncertain of what they felt. "They walk to him," whispered one. "Even the lions." From villages and towns nearby they came, children holding their parents' hands, traders pausing mid-journey, elders leaning on staffs. They formed circles on the hills, lines along the ridges, eyes fixed on the ark that now seemed more than wood. Noah, the one they called a fool, stood still at the foot of something holy. He gave no speeches. He offered no explanation. He simply opened the great doors of the ark and stood aside as the animals entered, one pair at a time. Some in the crowd shook their heads. "It is a trick," they muttered. Others could not look away. For what they saw was not showmanship. It was something ancient and sacred. The ark no longer stood merely as a structure. It had become a sign, a wonder. They saw birds settle onto beams. Oxen kneel gently as they crossed the threshold. Turtles moving slowly with the patience of centuries. And though some still laughed, the laughter was quieter now. A few hearts stirred, not yet changed, but softened. For even the proud cannot look upon wonder forever without being moved. Still most returned to their homes. They shook their heads and muttered, "It means
nothing."
But in their eyes lingered a question they could not put into words. Noah said nothing. He did not try to convince them. He simply kept the gate open and watched the procession continue. He knew the invitation had been extended. The call had gone out, not just to beasts, but to man. And though many turned away, the ark continued to fill with life. Space for all within the great structure, the work of welcome had already been done. Rooms had been measured, straw laid thick and soft, jars filled with clean water, perches made high for those that would fly, pens enclosed for those that would roam. Noah's sons moved gently among the animals, guiding them not with force, but with calm hands and calm voices. The creatures did not resist. They seemed to know their places, each one drawn to the space, prepared for them. Great beasts like giraffes bowed their long necks to enter. tiny creatures nestled in corners where sunlight pooled through the narrow windows above. The walls echoed not with roars or howls, but with the quiet breath of peaceful coexistence. Each species had a home, each life had a place. There was no scrambling, no fighting. The order held true. Noah's daughters-in-law moved between the pens, pouring water, placing food, stroking the heads of those who nuzzled near. In their hands mercy flowed, in their eyes wonder dwelled. Birds nested in rafters, cats curled near warm straw. Even insects hummed quietly in their own corners, kept not in cages but in gentle containment. Nothing was left to chance, nothing forgotten. The ark was more than wood. It had become a sanctuary, a world within the world, a shelter not only from storm but from fear. In each pen, a story waited. In each pair of eyes, a legacy would continue. The ark did not merely preserve
Life, it honored it.
it cherished it. And in the stillness of the structure, the air thick with breath and straw and grace, God's design was visible. Not in lightning or fire, but in the quiet harmony of lion and lamb lying near. Signs in the skies. Outside, the heavens began to whisper their change. The skies, once clear and vast, began to shift. Clouds formed more often now, soft at first, like cotton in the wind. But each day they grew darker, denser, lingering longer over the horizon. The air grew heavy, as if the earth itself was holding its breath.
Leaves turned in strange directions. Birds grew quieter in the trees. Even the forest seemed to still, as though it knew something sacred was near. Noah watched the skies, not with dread, but with understanding. This was not punishment, it was
Fulfillment. The promise made long ago in stillness was beginning to speak again, not in words, but in wind. He felt it in his bones. The shift, the nearness. The ark stood ready. The animals were inside. His family was gathered. The final days had arrived. The people still came, still watched, but now their voices were softer. Even those who laughed did so without strength, for the signs were clear. In the heavens, in the fields, in the hush that spread through creation like a sacred veil. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the clouds above caught fire in its light, Noah stood outside the ark and closed his eyes. The wind passed through his robe, whispering around him like the breath of God. He did not ask when the rain would come. He did not plead for more time. He had waited long. He had obeyed fully. And now the world waited too. Beneath the changing sky, beneath the watchful stars, beneath the hush of the trees, everything was ready. And the ark, quiet, steady, full of breath and faith, waited with them. Chapter 6. The door stands open. Morning light lay gentle upon the hills, like the hand of God resting upon his creation. The wind moved through the tall grass, carrying with it the hush of a world on the edge of change. And before the ark, its frame complete, its interior filled, its sanctuary prepared, stood Noah. His robe was worn from years of labor, his hands calloused from the weight of obedience. Yet his voice, when he spoke, was steady and full of grace. Before him, a crowd had gathered, drawn not by belief, but by curiosity. Men and women, young and old, those who had mocked and those who had merely watched, now stood beneath the warming sky, gazing at the impossible vessel. Noah did not shout, he did not plead. His voice was calm, and his words came slowly, as though carried by the very breath of heaven. "There is still time," he said, his eyes sweeping across the people. "The door remains open." His words fell like dew upon the earth, gentle, clear, and without weight of accusation. He was not angry, he was not proud, he simply spoke the truth, shaped in compassion. "The rain will come," he continued, "not because I desire it, but because the Lord has spoken. He has made a place for those who will listen. There is room. Even now there is room." Some turned away. Others laughed softly, uncertain whether they believed or feared. A few lowered their heads but made no move. The ark's door stood wide, tall and strong, a shadowed invitation. And Noah, the man who had listened long ago to the voice in the silence, now became that voice to others. Not with thunder, not with fire, but with faith. He waited after his words, giving space for hearts to stir. But the crowd, though quiet, did not move forward. One by one they turned again toward the lives they knew, fields to tend, homes to clean, stories to tell. The moment passed like a breeze through leaves. Noah stepped back from the threshold. His heart did not harden. He simply nodded as one who has done what he was asked. The door stood open, and heaven waited. One last sunrise. The next morning, the sun rose over the hills with a beauty that seemed deeper than usual. It stretched golden fingers across the sky, brushing the clouds with soft fire. The trees swayed gently, their leaves whispering in the wind, and the birds sang as they always had. The world, for a brief moment, appeared untouched, whole, bright, full of life. The dew clung to every blade of grass. A fox trotted across a distant ridge, its tail flicking like
a ribbon behind it. A line of ants moved with purpose across a fallen branch. Everything was as it had always been.
And yet, something in the air felt changed. Noah stood once more outside the ark, his eyes lifted toward the sky, not in search of clouds, but in reverence. This was the last sunrise the earth would know as it had been, the final breath of peace, before the winds turned wild. Inside the ark, the animals stirred. Their sounds were quiet, content. No cries of fear, no restlessness, only breath and presence. Noah's wife moved gently among them, laying her hand on the flank of a resting ox, checking the stores of water and grain. His sons stood near, watching the horizon. The birds flying overhead circled in wider arcs as if sensing a coming shift. Still, the sun continued to climb. Still, the world held its calm. In the distance, children played. Women fetched water. The scent of baking bread drifted on the breeze. Those who had seen the ark the day before spoke of it again, but the urgency had faded. Life resumed its rhythms. Noah said nothing. He knew this sunrise was a gift, a final
Kindness, a golden farewell to a world soon to be changed, not punishment, not wrath,
but cleansing, renewal. And as the light bathed the great vessel in warmth, the ark did not groan. It stood quiet and still, like a cradle waiting for the storm. A choice. Unmade, the crowd returned once more. fewer in number now, some with eyes cast low. A man held his daughter's hand, and she tugged at him gently. "Father," she said, pointing to the ark, "shall we go?" He hesitated. His eyes lingered on the open door. There was no barrier, no guard, just open space, wide enough for anyone who chose to enter. But his feet stayed where they were. Around him, others stood silently. They looked not only at the ark, but at one another. What would it mean to cross that threshold? To leave behind the familiar for something unseen? A woman whispered to her mother, her voice trembling, "What if the old man is right?" But the mother turned away, shaking her head. "If the rain comes, we will find shelter," she said. "We have always found shelter." The animals inside the ark made no sound of alarm. They waited, ordered, peaceful. The door remained open. Children stared with wide eyes, some pulling gently on their parents' robes. But no one stepped forward. Not one crossed the line from witness to believer. The air felt different now, thicker, as if the sky had begun to hold its breath. Yet still the choice stood clear, and still it went unmade. Noah did not call out again. His work was done. The invitation had been spoken. The years of building, of praying, of preparing, they had all led to this quiet, holy stillness. And in that stillness, the hearts of many turned back to the familiar, back to the dust of their streets, back to the shadows of their doubt. The door closes. The moment came, not with noise, but with breathless silence. The air grew still. Even the wind seemed to stop and listen. Clouds had begun to gather in the sky, heavy, grey, full of promise and sorrow. Noah stood at the edge of the ark, his family behind him, the animals already inside, the door still open. But something shifted, unseen by man yet deeply felt. And then, slowly, with no hands to pull or push, the great door began to move. It creaked gently on its hinges, its wood groaning like a sigh, ancient and full of meaning. Noah turned. His sons watched in awe. The door moved steadily as if led by an invisible hand, not of man, but of heaven. It came to rest against the frame with finality, not slammed, not forced, but sealed.
A hush fell upon the world. Inside the ark, all was still. Outside, the first drop of rain fell. It struck the earth softly like a tear. Then another, and another. The sky, once bright, now thickened with clouds. The light faded to a soft grey. Noah's
wife sat beside the animals, her hands folded. His sons stood with heads bowed. His daughters-in-law whispered prayers. The world outside still moved, slowly at first. A man lifted his face to the sky. "It will pass," he said. But the rain did not stop. It fell gently at first, like a lullaby. But it carried a weight the earth had never known, and the ark, silent, sealed, sure, stood waiting in the rain. A vessel, not just of survival, but of faith, a cradle of covenant, a promise wrapped in wood. Inside there was no fear, only stillness. Outside, the rain began to write a new beginning, drop by drop. Chapter 7. The Rain Begins. It did not begin with a storm. No trumpet sounded, no roar split the heavens. The skies, once clear and vast, had grown heavy in the days before, as though they carried a secret too weighty for words. The morning had come like any other, with its gentle light resting upon the curve of the hills, the whisper of wind through the trees, and the slow waking of creatures near and far. But in the quiet of that hour, something shifted. The first drop fell, soft, unnoticed. It touched the soil and vanished. Another followed, and another, like the tender tapping of fingers against the roof of the world. It was not loud, it was not fierce, it was slow and calm, a whisper from heaven. Noah stood by the narrow opening in the ark's upper wall, his eyes fixed not on the horizon, but on the space just beyond the wood, the place where sky met the first raindrops. He had waited long for this moment. Not with dread, but with holy expectation. For years he had built, for seasons beyond count he had prepared. And now the promise had arrived, not in fury, but in silence. The rain did not rush, but it did not stop. It came steady, humble, as if reluctant to carry the burden it bore. The sky, once painted in blue and gold, had turned to silver and ash. It was no longer wide and endless. It was close now, almost pressing down upon the earth. The drops grew more frequent, more certain. They ran in lines down the great wooden sides of the ark. They pooled in the grooves between planks. They touched every branch, every leaf, every stone. The animals inside stirred, sensing the change. Birds quieted their song. The breath of the earth slowed. The rain had begun, and it would not cease. A song of water. As the day turned slowly forward, the soft beginning gave way to a sacred rhythm. The rain fell not in chaos, but in cadence. It tapped upon the ark like the fingers of God, drumming out a song of sorrow and grace. The roof echoed with it, a steady, living lullaby. This was no ordinary storm. It was not the rage of nature, nor the fury of the wind. It was something deeper, something holy. The Creator himself had composed it. A song of water, a song of remembrance. The droplets joined one another, joining rivulets that traced the shape of the ark, weaving their way down like tears down a face. It was a weeping, yes, but not of despair. It was the lament of a world that had lost its way, the mourning of a father for the children who had turned away. Yet it was also a cleansing. The sound of each drop washing over the ark was a benediction. It was as if heaven itself had stooped low to brush the earth clean. Water, the ancient gift of life, now became the instrument of judgment, not to destroy for destruction's sake, but to purify, to reset, to renew. Within the ark, the sound was soft but constant. It filled the air, a cloak of sound around every breath and prayer. Noah sat with his family, their heads bowed. No one spoke. There was no need. The rain spoke enough. Its music was both gentle and heavy, like the voice of God breathing across the waters again, just as in the beginning. The children of Noah rested near their parents, hands folded. The animals had grown still, their instincts quieted, their movements peaceful. Outside, the ground was darkening. Puddles became pools. Pools began to stretch. The dust of the world, so long lifted by the feet of the proud, was being washed away. The song continued, unbroken, unwavering. It was not loud, but it was complete. Crowds scatter beyond the ark, where the door had once stood open but now was sealed by the hand of heaven. The people began to stir with unease. At first, the rain had been dismissed. "It is only a passing storm," some said. "The sky will clear." But it did not. The steady fall became a steady flood. Streets became streams. Paths that once led to the fields now led to rushing water. The laughter that had once echoed around the ark was now replaced by murmurs. The fields became slick and heavy. The wind picked up, not wild but persistent, carrying with it the scent of deep waters rising. Farmers saw their crops bend low under the weight. Traders found the roads washed over, and children, once carefree, clung closer to their mothers. The crowds that had gathered out of curiosity were now scattered by fear. Some tried to return to the ark. They made their way to the ridge where the great vessel stood, but the waters had already begun to gather around its base. The door was shut, not locked by man, but closed by the Lord. No voice called from within. No figure stood at the threshold. The time for warnings had passed. The ones who hesitated, who mocked, who questioned and delayed, they now saw. But the choice was behind them, sealed like the door of the ark itself. Panic had not yet come, but dread had. "It cannot be," they said. "It will end soon." But the rain did not stop. It poured from the skies with sacred precision. It filled the cracks in the earth. It turned hills into rivulets, dry beds into rivers. Some climbed to higher ground. Some tried to gather their animals. Some simply stood in the rain, their faces turned upward, unsure whether to cry or pray. The warnings they had laughed at now echoed in their minds. The ark, once a monument of ridicule, was now the only refuge. But the door stood still, silent. Shut by heaven's hand, the rain had spoken, and it would not be undone. Safe within the wood, inside the ark, a different world remained. While the outside churned and flooded, the air within was calm, sacred, and sure. The walls of cypress, sealed with pitch, held strong against the water's growing hunger. The wood did not creak in fear. It embraced its purpose with quiet strength. The great door did not rattle. It stood fast in obedience. The animals, gathered 2 by 2, were not disturbed. They shifted gently in their places, their breath even, their eyes soft. There was no panic, no disorder. The ark, though filled with life, was filled also with peace. Noah knelt with his family, their circle small but unshaken. Hands were joined. Prayers were whispered, not asking for rescue, but offering thanks. Not crying for answers, but giving trust. It was not the silence of uncertainty, but the silence of surrender. Each one had given their heart to God long before the rain began. Now they simply rested in that offering. The noise of the rain outside grew louder, but it did not disturb them. It became like the sound of sleep, steady, holy, cradling them in assurance. Every wall of the ark bore the marks of their obedience, every beam soaked in years of faith. And now that faith became shelter. They could not see the waters outside. They did not know how high they would rise, but they knew the one who had called them. And that knowing was enough. The world was changing, being rewritten by water and grace. But inside, within the heart of the ark, trust held firm. No fear found its way through the seams. Only prayer. Only presence. Only peace. The ark floated not just upon the waters, it floated upon the promises of God. As the sky poured and the rivers rose, the ark remained steady. And in that steady place, faith rested, not with might, but with quiet confidence. The flood had begun, but the covenant was already at work. Chapter 8. The waters rise. The sky no longer whispered, it wept. And below the surface of the world something ancient stirred. For 40 days and 40 nights the rain had not relented, and now the earth itself could hold no more. From deep, within the unseen chambers beneath the soil, fountains burst forth, sudden and wild, as if the heart of creation had been pierced. Waters surged from beneath the roots of trees, from the mouths of caves, from cracks in the hillsides long forgotten by time. It was not simply the sky pouring down, it was the earth crying up. The deep places, hidden and sacred, opened there.
Mouths and the waters of chaos returned. Noah, watching from the window above, saw the rain become more than rain. It mixed with steam, with thunder, with trembling. The ground that had once supported his labor, his prayers, and the feet of generations,
now churned with unrest. Trees were ripped from their moorings, stones rolled like toys in a child's hand. The rivers broke their banks, becoming endless currents. What had once been held in place, order, rhythm, soil, was now undone. Creation was unmaking itself, under the will of the one who formed it. Inside the ark, the sounds were muffled but not distant. The tremble of the ground reached even the souls of those resting in the upper rooms. The animals, calm but aware, grew still. Some eyes looked too, Noah as if seeking understanding. But Noah did not tremble. He bowed his head. He knew that what was breaking open was not destruction, but cleansing. It was painful, yes, loud and overwhelming, but it was necessary. The old world had been steeped in violence, pride, and forgetfulness. Now the deep, hidden places of the world were rising to wash it clean. The skies cried above. The fountains burst below. The ark, sealed and silent, stood between two realms, untouched by flood, yet surrounded by it. Outside, the world groaned. Inside, the word held firm. Hills become islands. The waters did not rest. They climbed. Steadily, relentlessly, they rose, devouring all that had once felt solid beneath the feet of men. Fields where children had once laughed became oceans. Villages where bread had been baked and fires had burned now lay beneath swirling depths. The roots of trees vanished, and their branches followed. Livestock, abandoned and confused, were swallowed by waves that knew no mercy. The valleys were the first to disappear. They filled like bowls. Homes were covered, walls collapsed, roads dissolved. People who had once walked confidently upon dry land now fled to higher ground. They climbed hills with desperate hands. They reached for anything that stood above. The swelling tide, some cried out to gods they had carved. Others cursed the sky. Many wept for what they had not believed. The great cities, proud and unshaken for generations, found themselves defenseless. Stone towers crumbled under the weight of water. Marketplaces disappeared beneath swirling floods. Temples and homes stood no chance. Nothing was strong enough to stand against the rising judgment. From the ark's upper window, only the very tips of the highest peaks remained. Green slopes became islands, then even the islands were consumed. The mountains, bold and ancient, held out longest. But as the days passed, even their dignity was lowered. The waters reached them, climbed their ridges and spread across their sides. One by one, the peaks surrendered. Their summits, long kissed by clouds and winds, now met the rising tide. The world had become sea, a vast, endless deep where once there had been seasons, color, and sound. The earth, like a child in fever, now rested beneath a blanket of water. And still the rain did not cease. Above this ocean of sorrow, only the ark remained, drifting, waiting, carried not by currents, but by covenant. The cry outside the ark. It was not long before the water reached the very place where the ark had stood. As the deep rose around it, the vessel lifted, slowly at first, gently, like a cradle being taken up by a loving hand. But soon the water surged faster, and the cries began. From outside, the ark came pounding, desperate, wild. Fists struck the walls that had once seemed foolish. Palms slapped the sealed door, pleading, clawing, hoping. Voices once filled with mockery now screamed with urgency. Mothers called out for their children, fathers begged for the chance to enter. Sons shouted for their parents, but the door did not move. No one inside the ark touched it. No hand of man could open what God Himself had sealed. The voices outside were not ignored. They were heard. Heard by Noah. Heard by his sons. Heard even by the animals whose bodies tensed at the anguish. But the silence inside was unbroken. It was not silence of apathy, but of obedience. Noah wept, quietly, deeply. His heart broke for the cries beyond the walls. But he had no key, no power to open what heaven had closed. His tears joined the water, unseen but present. His family gathered near, some holding each other, some covering their ears against the wailing. They grieved not with guilt, but with compassion. The cries faded not because the people stopped calling, but because the water silenced them. One by one the sounds drowned beneath the waves. Where once there had been shouts, there came stillness. The pounding slowed, then stopped. The door remained closed. The ark, sealed in mercy and obedience, floated on. Outside, the world fell, silent beneath the deep. No echo remained. Only water, only sky, and the judgment was complete. Adrift in the deep, now the rain continued, not in fury, but in rhythm. The ark rose with it, gently swaying upon the waves. It was no longer grounded, no longer tethered to any hill or ridge. It floated in the great silence, like a lantern adrift on an endless sea. There was no direction, no destination, only trust, only surrender. Inside, the family moved slowly. The animals, calmed by something unseen, rested or watched. The groaning of the deep had quieted, replaced now with the sound of water slapping softly against the vessel's sides. Wind brushed across the hull. The ark creaked, but it did not break. It moved, but it did not wander. There was no map, no sign of land. All the world was water, Yet within the walls of that ark, peace abided. It was not the peace of knowledge, nor of control. It was the peace of faith, the deep, sacred kind that comes not from seeing, but from knowing the One who sees all. At night, Noah would sit near the upper opening, looking at the sky. He no longer sought the land, he sought only presence. The stars were hidden behind clouds, the moon gave no light, but still he prayed, and still God listened. The ark rocked with the wind, the water stretched beyond vision. But the vessel did not drift alone. The Lord was near, not in thunder, but in the silent keeping of every beam, every breath, every heart inside. The days passed, though the world no longer marked them. There was no sun to count, no shadows to chase. Time had become a tide, but the ark held and the promise held with it. In that wooden cradle, carved by obedience and sealed by heaven's hand, life remained. And in that life, a quiet hope waited, not loud, not urgent, but certain. For though the flood had risen high, it could not reach beyond the reach of God. And in the stillness of the deep, he was already preparing the ground for what would come next. The waters had risen. The world had changed, but faith still floated, anchored in grace, drifting toward renewal. Chapter 9, 40 Nights. The sun rose and the sun set, but the sky gave no warmth, no golden light. It was veiled in a cloak of ash and silver, thick clouds that wept without pause. Day bled into night, and night into day, and still the rain fell. A curtain of water, soft and steady, never angry, but never ending. The rhythm of creation had changed, the beating of hooves, the rustling of leaves, the hum of human voices, all had faded. In their place, the world now moved to the sound of rain. It was everywhere, on the roof of the ark, on the wooden beams, on the faces of those who once walked proudly through the fields. The drops, countless and calm, fell with purpose. They soaked the earth that once resisted, they filled every crevice and hollow. The waters did not crash. They climbed. The seas reached for the sky, and the skies bent low to meet them. Inside the ark, the sound was constant, a sacred pulse, gentle but sure. It lulled some to sleep, kept others awake. It filled the silence of conversations not needed and prayers. Too deep for words, the family lived by the rhythm of water, not by time, for time had lost its shape. No sun marked the hours, no shadow lengthened or shortened. The rain became their clock, their song, their scripture. Each morning brought more of the same sound, the same sight, the same movement of the ark rocking on unseen depths. But though the view outside never changed, something inside them did. They were being carved like wood beneath the patient hand of a master, not by trial, but by trust. And still the rain fell, not to punish, but to purify, not to drown, but to prepare. 40 nights, 40 days, the world washed, the world waiting, hearts growing weary. Inside the ark, though peace remained, the weight of waiting grew heavier with each day. The walls, once so freshly built, now creaked with dampness. The scent of wood mingled with straw, with animal breath, with time. The lanterns burned gently, casting golden light against the beams, but even light grew tired when there was no end in sight. The animals, though calm, stirred more often. The lowing of cattle, the flapping of wings, the rustling of small creatures in their nests. It was not panic, only restlessness, as if all creation, even when saved, still longed for the world outside, for grass, for sky, for open air. Noah's family moved carefully, speaking less now. Words were not always needed. The silence between them held understanding, but also weariness. Sleep came easily, but did not refresh as it once had. Meals were simple, chores were many. Each day was lived with the same view. Water against, the window, sky pressed low, and the sound of rain like an old song that would not end. The young ones, though strong in faith, grew tired of the sameness. One son sat long at the base of the upper wall, tracing the grain of the wood with his finger, not to pass time, but to feel something certain. Another daughter-in-law prayed not aloud, but in rhythm with the waves, her fingers twisting the corner of her shawl. Noah's wife, ever steady, moved gently between them all. She offered warm food, kind glances, quiet reassurances. Her presence was like a candle that never flickered. But even she, at times, stood in the doorway between rooms and closed her eyes for just a moment too long. Faith was not absent. It lived in each of them. But faith too can grow weary, not from doubt, but from longing. And yet in their weariness they endured, not because they saw an end, but because they trusted the one who held the rain. Noah watches and waits. Each day Noah climbed the wooden ladder to the upper window. It was narrow, shaped for light and breath, not escape. Through it he would look upon the world that no longer was, and what he saw day after day was the same. Water stretching in every direction, no land, no branch, no bird, no dozen, only clouded sky and moving waves. But Noah did not look with despair. His eyes were old but clear. They did not search for signs. They watched in trust. He knew that what he could not see was still in God's hands, that below the flood, the world waited, changed but not lost. He would place his hand gently on the wooden edge of the window and stand there, quiet, unmoving. Some days he would speak a soft prayer, not asking for the rain to stop, but thanking God that they were held. Some days he would simply listen, to the wind, to the creak of the vessel, to the voice of silence that only faith can hear. His beard had grown longer, his shoulders more tired, but his spirit remained firm. He did not pace. He did not sigh. He simply waited. He waited like the earth waits for spring, not impatiently, not lazily, but faithfully. His eyes never searched for control. They searched for peace. He knew that when the time came, the same voice that once whispered, "Build," would whisper again, "Open." Until then, he would watch. And while others may have watched for answers, Noah watched for presence. In the watching, he worshipped. In the waiting, he obeyed. And in the stillness of 40 unchanging days, he learned what only the long rain could teach, that God is faithful, even when the skies never clear. A promise in the darkness. At night, when the lanterns were low, and the ark drifted like a cradle in the hand of God, the rain still fell. There was no thunder, no lightning, just the steady patter of drops upon the roof, like fingers gently tapping out a lullaby. And in that sound, peace settled over them. It was a strange kind of peace, not the peace that comes with understanding, but the kind that arrives when understanding has no place. It did not speak. It simply covered. It wrapped around them like a shawl, like the hush that falls over a sleeping child. In the darkest hours, when not even a star shone through the clouds, Noah would wake sometimes and listen. He would feel the ark rocking, the boards breathing beside him. And though he could see nothing, he would smile, for he knew God was near. Not outside in a voice, not above in a vision, but inside, within. Sometimes his wife would wake too, and they would hold hands, neither one needing words. There was nothing to say. They were in the promise, not the fulfillment, not yet, but the promise itself. Even in the darkness there was light, not from the sun, but from the certainty that they were not forgotten. Though the earth was hidden, beneath water and the sky offered no sign of change, God's nearness was enough. This peace did not remove the questions. It quieted them. It did not end the waiting. It made it bearable. And it did not explain the storm. It sat with them through it, and so on the 40th night, when the rain still sang and the stars still hid, Noah whispered softly, "You are
Here. It was not a question. It was worship. And the ark rocked gently on the deep, held not only by water, but by a presence greater than the flood. The rain would cease, the skies would change, and the world would be made new. But that
was for another day. Tonight they rested in the middle of the mystery. And that was enough. Chapter 10. The Ocean World. The days no longer wore names and the nights no longer chased them. There was no morning sun to rise, no evening star to rest upon. Only clouds above and water below. The ark floated gently, steady in motion, alone in an ocean that had no edges. It was a sea with no shore, stretching beyond the eyes of those inside, wrapping around the world like a veil pulled over a dreaming face. Noah often stood at the narrow window, hands resting on the edge of the wood, eyes scanning the horizon. But he did not search for signs. He knew none would yet appear. There were no mountain tops, no trees reaching skyward, no birds darting across the wind. The world had gone quiet beneath the waves, and all that remained visible was the ark, drifting like a prayer cradled in the hands of God. The water was not violent. It did not thrash or scream. It moved with solemn patience, gliding beneath the
vessel, lifting it, guiding it nowhere, yet somewhere, toward whatever lay on the other side of waiting.
Wind stirred from time to time, brushing across the hull, but even it seemed reverent, unwilling to disturb what was now sacred. This was no longer the earth as they had known it. The cities were gone, the roads were buried, the gardens, the fields, the homes, all hidden under the vast blue silence. And yet, what looked like emptiness was not abandonment. It was renewal, begun in stillness. The flood did not forget. It prepared. Inside the ark, they did not fear the endless water. It was not their enemy. It was their passage. The surface of the deep reflected nothing. No stars, no sun. But it mirrored a truth within them. that sometimes to begin again, everything must become nothing first. Life in the wooden womb within the ark, the world had not stopped. It had simply changed. The walls of Cyprus, darkened with moisture and time, now enclosed a kind of living temple. The ark, shaped by obedience and sealed by mercy, had become a womb, a wooden sanctuary holding the future in quiet breath. The animals breathed softly in their places. They did not fight, they did not hunger. Their instincts were softened, as though even their natures had heard the hush of God's presence. Lambs nestled beside birds. Oxen stood still in their pens. From the smallest insect to the largest creature, each moved with a kind of reverence, as if they too knew they had been chosen to carry life through the flood. Among the people, new rhythms were born. Lamps were lit in the darkness, casting warm circles of light on the walls. Meals were shared, in whispers. Songs, soft, ancient, remembered from the days of Eden's edge, rose like incense into the rafters. They were not songs of mourning, but of quiet hope. And even in that place, new life stirred. A goat gave birth to 2 young. A dove laid eggs high in the beams. A mother, tired but radiant, cradled her newborn, the child's breath barely a whisper.
Against the stillness, the ark, though adrift, was alive. They swept the floors, they folded garments, they cared for one another. The children were taught the names of the animals, the words of the old stories.
Noah sat with them, voice low and kind, and spoke of the garden, of Adam, of the beauty that once was, not to lament, but to remember. The ark was not just a vessel of survival, it was a sacred shelter of living. It was a reminder that even when the world outside is drowning, life within can still flourish. The womb of wood held not just breath, but promise. Waiting with purpose. Time inside the ark did not move quickly, nor did it stand still. It drifted like the vessel itself, steady and unhurried. There were no clocks to count the hours, no bells to mark the days, but each day held meaning, shaped not by events, but by intention. Every morning, Noah and his family rose before the first light tried to press through the clouds. They began their tasks with quiet hands. Water was fetched from storage jars. The animals were tended to with gentle attention. Grain was measured out, shared fairly, received gratefully. No one hurried, no one idled. There was work, but it was sacred. There was routine, but it was wrapped in reverence. They waited, yes, but they waited with purpose. As the children learned to care for the smaller creatures, they also listened. The stories, passed from mouth to ear, from heart to heart, of a garden where the river split 4 ways, of a tree whose fruit was forbidden, of a walk in the cool of the day with the Lord. These were not tales of regret. They were memories of goodness, signposts pointing to what could come again. Evenings came like soft cloaks, falling gently over their shoulders. They sat together and watched the lanterns flicker. Some sang, others whispered thanks, and always they listened for the creak of the ark, for the soft rustling of feathers, for the peace that filled the air like perfume. They did not ask, "When will this end?" Instead, they asked, "What can we do with today?" For though they drifted without sight of land, they did not drift in spirit. They were anchored, not to the ground, but to God. And so the waiting did not waste them. It deepened them. The water had removed the world, but inside the ark, something new was growing. Not roots in soil, but roots in trust. The God who waits. Too, in all their days within the ark, they never heard a voice from the heavens. There was no vision in the night, no sign in the clouds, and yet they never felt alone. For though the skies were sealed and the waters high, God was near. Not in movement, not in miracles, but in presence. He waited too, not because he was slow and not because he had forgotten, but because waiting is part of love. Just as the seed must rest beneath the soil before it can bloom, so must the soul rest in God's timing. The Lord who once walked with Adam, who once spoke to Noah in the quiet dawn. He still walked, still spoke. But now he waited, watching over the ark as it rocked gently in the sea. His eyes did not wander, his care did not falter. The world had been covered in water, but it had not been
abandoned. His timing is like the tide, slow, sure, always reaching. It cannot be rushed. It cannot be feared.
And while the ark drifted, it did not drift apart from him. It moved as he willed, unseen currents guided by unseen hands. Even the silence of heaven was not empty. It was full of patience, of purpose, of peace. Every drop of rain, every breath. Within the ark, every moment of stillness was part of the story God was still writing, and so the ark floated on, not lost, not forgotten, but held. The water beneath, the cloud above, the wood around, all wrapped in the waiting of a God who knew that new things must begin slowly. The flood had washed away the noise. Now it made room for the quiet birth of hope. Chapter 11. The First Ray of Light. There came a morning unlike the 40 before it, when the world awoke not to the patter of rain, but to something far more still. At first, it was hard to tell what had changed. The ark creaked just as it always had. The animals shifted in their pens. The sea beneath still rocked the vessel in its sacred rhythm. But the sound, the endless weeping of the skies, was no longer there. Noah stirred before the others, awakened not by noise, but by the absence of it. For the first time in weeks, the roof above his head did not echo with falling water. He sat up slowly, the hush so deep it felt like reverence. Even the animals seemed to hold their breath, sensing a shift too holy to disturb. Climbing the ladder to the narrow window above, Noah reached the same place he had stood so many days before. But now, as he pressed his hand to the wood and leaned into the space where wind once whispered and water once fell, he saw it. A break in the clouds. Thin at first. Just a sliver, but enough. Sunlight. A single ray, soft and golden, poured down through the parting sky. It fell like a ribbon across the endless sea, glimmering on the surface of the deep. It did not shout. It did not blaze. It simply touched the water, gently. A blessing. A promise. Noah did not speak. He closed his eyes, let the warmth kiss his face, and breathed in deeply. There were no more tears from heaven, no more pounding, no more mourning. The rain had done its work, and now it rested, the sky once grey and swollen with sorrow, now began to breathe again. Slowly, softly. The first morning of silence had arrived, and with it, the first whisper of renewal. A sky rekindled. When the rest of the family awoke, they felt it too. The air had changed. It no longer smelled of dampness and weight. It smelled clean, like new leaves before they unfold, like riverbanks after a storm. The sharpness in their lungs made them pause as they breathed it in, as if tasting something they had forgotten. Japheth was the first to climb up beside his father. His eyes scanned the horizon, his hand shielding his face from the thin beam of sunlight. He blinked, unaccustomed to the brightness. For so long their world had been painted in greys and shadows. Even a single ray was enough to pierce their memory of light. Shem followed, and then Ham. Each one came to the window, shoulders brushing, eyes lifting. They did not speak, but they shared a silence woven with awe. Noah's wife and the daughters-in-law soon joined, holding their cloaks tighter around them, not from cold, but from wonder. The narrow light stretched slowly across the deck, illuminating beams darkened by rain. Dust danced in the sunbeam, flickering like tiny stars. It felt like a visitation, like the presence of something too holy to name. Their eyes ached at first, but their hearts stirred. The light reminded them of something older than memory, of mornings in the garden, of a world before the fall, of a time when God's face shone openly upon the earth. It was not just the end of rain. It was the rekindling of hope. They stood together, faces bathed in gold, like flowers opening after a long night. And though the ark still floated and no land was in sight, they knew the journey had shifted, not because they could see the end, but because they had seen the sky. The floating stillness. The rain had stopped, but the waters remained. The ark still drifted upon the deep, surrounded on all sides by endless sea. It was a strange stillness, not lifeless, but alive in its own quiet way. The surface of the water reflected the sky above, now pierced with streaks of light. Clouds moved slowly, like ancient ships returning home. Inside the ark, the air felt lighter. The tension, once unspoken but deeply felt, had softened. Lamps burned a little brighter. Meals were taken with gentler conversation. The waiting had not ended, but it had changed. The ark did not move with haste. It rocked as before, slow, patient, like a cradle. There was no wind to drive it, no current to push it forward, just stillness. But within that stillness was a calm, stronger than any wind. Each family member resumed their work, but with new breath. Straw was replaced with care. Grain was measured again. The animals were tended not with duty alone, but with quiet gladness. Even the youngest among them laughed, a small laugh, soft and sudden, at the sight of a bird fluffing its feathers in the golden shaft of sun. Noah sat for a long time near the window, his hands folded in his lap. He said no words, but his silence was not empty. It was full of knowing, full of surrender. The flood had covered everything they once knew, but it had not drowned their faith. The sea stretched endlessly, but it was no longer feared. The water, though vast, now carried them like a promise wrapped in blue. They did not know when they would see land, but they knew now that they would. The world outside was silent, but inside a melody had begun, not sung, not spoken, just lived. A dove within the heart. Hope does not always come as a sign. Sometimes it comes as a stirring, like a bird fluttering in the chest, soft wings brushing against the ribs. It does not shout. It does not announce itself. It simply rises gentle and holy. And on that morning, as light returned to the sky, hope began to move within their hearts. It was not certainty. There was no mountain peak to see, no tree to touch. The world remained hidden beneath the waters. But within them, something had changed. Something had awakened. Noah, still seated near the narrow window, reached for the wooden perch beside him. A dove, white as the clouds that parted above, tilted its head. He stroked its feathers with tender fingers, his touch filled with reverence. He did not release it. Not yet. But the bird felt the change too. Hope was not in the act. It was in the waiting, in the readiness, in the flutter of wings not yet opened. The women sat near the central lamp that evening, their hands weaving together new garments, their eyes soft with thought. Shem and Japheth spoke of trees, of where they would plant them, of which seeds to scatter first. Ham hummed an old melody, one his mother had sung to him as a child, long before the rains came. No one said, "It is finished," for it was not. But their hearts said, "It is beginning." The dove within their hearts stirred again, not in flight, but in faith. For hope does not always wait for sight. It waits in trust. And as the ark floated still upon the vast and silent sea, the first ray of light settled across its roof. It lingered there like a hand of blessing, a kiss of dawn. Not the end, but the first soft sign that God was preparing to open the world once more. Chapter 12. The Resting Place. It began with the slightest sound, not a crash, not a break, but a shift. The ark, long adrift on the endless sea, suddenly stilled. It rocked no more. Its timbers groaned gently, as if exhaling after a long breath held. The family within noticed it together, not with alarm, but with wonder. It was early morning. The lamps had not yet been trimmed. The light from the windows was dim and blue, colored by the mists that still clung outside. But inside the ark, something changed. Noah sat near the upper window as he often did, his hands folded, his eyes distant but peaceful. He felt the subtle tilt of the floor beneath him shift and then hold steady. It was not the same as the gentle sway they had known for months. It was rooted, resting. Still, others gathered slowly, each one sensing what had happened. The ark had touched something below, something solid, something that had been hidden for so long beneath the waters. They did not know its name at first. They did not yet see peaks or ridges, but they felt it deep in the wood, in the joints of the frame, in the hush that followed. The vessel no longer drifted. It had come to rest. Not because they had reached the end, but because something beneath had risen. Not to destroy, but to support. The waters still spread in every direction, but somewhere below, The deep had given way to rock, to mountain, to earth. It was not the same earth they had left behind. It had been washed, cleansed, hidden. Now it returned in slow, sacred revelation. No one celebrated loudly. No shouts broke the morning's peace. They only breathed more deeply, walked more lightly. For though their eyes could not yet see it, their feet no longer floated. The ark, after all it had held and carried, had found its resting place. Ararat revealed. The days that followed unfolded with gentle grace. Mists began to lift, slow and swirling, like veils drawn back from the face of the world. And through those thin curtains of cloud they saw it, dark against the sky, firm and rising, the first peaks. Ararat. The mountain. Its summit stood tall, not boastful, but sure. It had remained hidden while the waters ruled, but now it emerged like a remembrance, a reminder that land still lived beneath the flood. It was not yet a full return. The valleys were still buried. The trees had not yet stretched toward the
heavens. But Ararat stood. Not all was revealed, but enough. And the ark had been the first to touch it. From the windows they watched as more peaks followed, soft humps of stone, ridges kissed by the sun. The world they once knew would never
return exactly as it was, but the bones of the earth remained, and that was enough. The animals grew more curious. Birds flapped their wings longer. The scent of new wind entered the ark, thin, cool and sharp, with the breath of rock and sky. The family spoke little, but their eyes met more often, and, in those glances, there was joy. Noah gave thanks quietly. His prayers rose like smoke, not with loud words, but with deep stillness. The mountain had been named before the flood, but now it was made holy by the touch of the ark. It had become the altar of a new beginning. Still they waited. The land appeared, the ark had settled, the sky had cleared, but still they waited. They did not rush. They did not climb down the sides or pry open the door. They remained within, not from fear but from obedience. Noah, though his heart stirred, knew what faith meant in this moment. It meant listening not only for the signs but for the voice. The land may have been dry, the birds may have stirred, but Noah waited for the word of God. He remembered the first call, build. He remembered the instructions, gather, seal, enter. And so he waited for the next command, leave. He would not act without it, not because he was uncertain, but because he trusted. Sometimes
faith moves, sometimes it stays.
And both are worship. The family continued their care of one another, of the animals, of the small world that still lived within the walls of the ark. They opened the windows wider now, letting in the sharper air. The light, brighter with each passing day, touched their faces and warmed their hands. They saw the mountain tops each morning. They watched the waters slowly retreat. The edges of the world were beginning to return. But they did not run toward it. They remained in the ark, not trapped, but sheltered, still honoring the call that brought them in. Patience was their offering. Waiting was their song, a time of still worship. In that stillness, between flood and flowering, Between judgment and joy, they worshipped. Not with cymbals and shouts, but with soft songs, whispered prayers, and sacred silence. It was not the celebration of arrival. It was the reverence of pause. They knew the journey was not finished. They had endured the storm. They had been carried through the deep. But now came something harder for many. The waiting after the danger, the stillness before the harvest. So they made their worship quiet. They swept the floors, folded their garments, cradled newborn animals in their arms. They sang lullabies. They told stories of the beginning, of Adam and Eve, of the garden's light, of the voice that once walked in the cool of the day. They honored their elders. They spoke kindly. They forgave quickly. Each act, though small, became incense. Their lives became the prayer. Noah, seated by the open window, looked out at Ararat and felt the weight of what had been and the promise of what was to come. He did not rush the moment. He bowed his head and let it rest there, suspended in holy time. Outside, the mountain held the ark in silence. Inside, the hearts of the faithful beat like soft drums, steady and true. The door would open one day. The animals would run. The land would bloom. But not today. Today was for still worship. And as the ark rested on that ancient peak, heaven watched. The earth breathed. The sky grew brighter, and the story waited for the next word. Chapter 13. The Dove Returns. The rain had ceased, and the sky, once heavy with judgment, now stretched wide in a hush of waiting. Over the still waters, the ark rested like a prayer caught between judgment and mercy. Within its wooden walls, Noah stood at a narrow window, his eyes weary but watching. Days had passed since the rain stopped, and though the waters had begun to recede, the world outside remained unknown, a mystery hidden beneath the silence of the deep. It was not yet time to open the doors, not yet time to step out. But Noah, the faithful servant of God, yearned for a sign. So he sent out a raven, dark, swift, and untethered. It flew back and forth over the waters, yet it did not return. It searched but did not bring back news. Its path was restless, its heart wild. Then Noah took another bird, not one of shadow, but of gentleness. A dove. White, pure, soft-winged. It was a creature that belonged to quiet mornings, to the cooing of peace under olive trees. This dove became his scout, a searcher of hope, sent into the unknown. Out through the narrow opening, Noah released it. The dove fluttered into the open sky, wings slicing gently through the cool air. Below it, the endless water shimmered like a mirror, reflecting clouds that no longer threatened. The dove flew across the surface, circling and seeking, dipping and rising, its small eyes searching for a resting place. But the world was not yet ready. There was no dry land, no branch to cling to, no home to rest upon. So the dove returned, its feathers damp from its journey, and Noah received it back with care. It had not succeeded in its mission, yet it had tried, and that, too, was holy. The first flight was not the end, but the beginning of the search. In that small act, Noah saw something more than failure. He saw faith. The dove had obeyed. It had gone forth in trust, returned in trust, and waited in silence for the time to try again. The olive leaf 7 more days passed. The ark creaked gently with the rhythm of the waters. Outside, the sun warmed the air, and the winds carried whispers of change. Noah, quiet and steady, counted the days. On the 7th, his heart stirred once more. He reached again for the dove, the same gentle creature, the one who knew the way. This time, when he opened his hands to release it, the air felt different, softer, more welcoming. As if the world itself had exhaled, the dove flew again, its wings like soft whispers against the sky. It did not turn back quickly. It did not
hover or circle in confusion. It flew onward, as though it knew something had shifted. Hours passed. Noah waited.
The family within the ark moved gently, each soul holding their breath in quiet hope. And then, in the fading golden light of evening, the flutter of wings returned. She came back, this time not empty. In her beak was a gift, a single olive.
Leaf, fresh, green, tender, small enough to fit in a child's palm, yet heavy with meaning.
Noah took the leaf gently from her beak and held it with trembling fingers. Around him, the others gathered. Sons and daughters, wife and daughters-in-law. They looked at the tiny leaf as though it were the crown of a kingdom. And in a way, it was. The olive leaf spoke without words. It told them the waters were retreating. Somewhere, an olive tree had survived, rooted deep in the soaked earth, lifting its leaves toward the light. It meant life. It meant restoration. It meant that the land, once drowned in wrath, was blooming again with God's promise. A whisper from the new world, not a trumpet blast, not fire from heaven, just a leaf, simple, soft, green. And yet it held more power than thunder, for it told them that peace had returned, joy in small things. In the days that followed, they kept the olive leaf close, not as a trophy, but as a treasure. They did not shout, they did not rush to open the doors. The leaf was not a call to run, but a call to wait with joy. The ark still rocked gently, and the world was still changing. But now the family inside no longer waited in dread. They waited in peace. Noah often held the leaf in his hands and traced its soft veins. He looked at its shape, its color, its delicacy, and in it he saw the kindness of God. Not just the judgment that had fallen in rain, but the mercy that followed. For this was God's rhythm, not wrath alone, but restoration. Not silence forever, but the return of birdsong. Around him, his family began to smile again. The laughter of children, once hushed by fear, began to rise in small notes. The animals stirred with new curiosity. The light inside the ark changed. It became softer, warmer, like the early dawn after a long night. They began to thank God, not just for survival, but for signs of life. And what a lesson it was to find joy in something so small. A leaf. Not a tree, not a forest, but a single leaf. Sometimes God speaks not in earthquakes or floods, but in the quiet rustle of a branch. He teaches us to listen, to look closely, to honor the beginning of things. The olive leaf was not the end of their journey, but it was a promise. And promises, no matter how small, are sacred when they come from heaven. So they cherished it, the leaf, and the faith that had carried the dove to it. They praised God not just for the great floodwaters that had passed, but for the gentle sign that showed them what was to come. In that small green sliver of life, they saw a whole world.
Rising anew, a farewell in flight be 7 more days past.
The sky outside had changed again. Where once clouds had swirled with judgment, now the light fell evenly across the water. Noah stepped once more to the window. In his hand, the dove rested again, soft, calm, trusting. He looked into its eyes and whispered something that only a friend would say. It was time. This was the third flight, the final flight, the farewell. He opened his hand, and the dove rose once more into the sky. But this time it did not return. Noah stood for hours, watching. He waited through the morning, into the afternoon, and through the quiet hush of evening. But the sky remained still. No flutter of returning wings, no sound of gentle cooing. The dove was gone, and yet he did not mourn. For this silence was not emptiness, it was fulfillment. The dove had found what it was looking for: a branch, a tree, a home. It had no need to return because it had landed where it belonged, inside. The ark, Noah and his family bowed their heads. They understood. The message had been delivered. The earth was no longer lost. The door of the ark would soon open. But before they stepped out, they honored this final sign. A creature who came in peace and left in peace, sent once more not with fear, but with freedom. The ark had been their refuge, their cradle, their vessel through the storm. But it was not meant to be forever. Like the dove, they too would leave soon. The world awaited. Trees would grow again, fields would bloom, children would run barefoot through green grass. The song of life would rise, gentle and strong. As the night fell, Noah looked once more at the sky where the dove had vanished. He closed his eyes, not with sorrow, but with stillness. He whispered a prayer, not of asking, but of gratitude. The storm had ended, the promise had begun, and like the dove, his heart had found peace. The ark floated softly in the twilight, as if exhaling the last breath of waiting. And the waters below, once wild and wide, now shimmered with the quiet promise of dry land. A new beginning waited just beyond the horizon, and heaven had sent a dove to show the way. Chapter 14, Leaving the Ark. The silence of the ark had grown sacred. For many days the wooden walls had held not only life, but quiet waiting, a stillness that had grown like a hush after a storm. Within those timbered corridors, Noah and his family lived gently, listening more than speaking, praying more than moving. Outside, the waters had steadily fallen, mountain tops had appeared, and dry land had emerged beneath the gaze of heaven. But Noah did not move until the voice of God returned. And then it came, soft, sure, and unmistakable, a voice that did not need to shout because it carried the authority of eternity. God said, "Come out," just as he had once called Noah. In now he called him out. The words were not a command of departure, but an invitation into promise. The same door that had once been sealed shut, closed tight by the hand of God against the fury of the flood, now opened again. this time with sunlight streaming through. Noah stood before the door, his heart full. He remembered the day it had closed behind them. The sound of rain, the cries of animals, the trembling of earth. But today there was only stillness. The handle, once untouched, was now turned with sacred trust. As the great wooden door creaked open, a soft golden light flooded into the ark, painting the walls with warmth. The smell of fresh air drifted in, carrying the scent of soil, of trees, of something old and something new. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the world opened itself to them again. Not the world they had left, but a new one, born through water, shaped by waiting, held in God's mercy. The doorway was no longer an exit from safety, but a passage into restoration. God had spoken, and Noah would answer, not with words, but with movement. One step, then another, toward the light, toward the promise. First steps on new earth. The first to walk through the door was not just Noah. It was faith itself, stepping softly upon the damp earth. His family followed, each soul moving slowly, reverently, as if entering a holy place. Their feet sank slightly into the mud, the soil still soft from waters not long gone. Around them, the air shimmered with a quiet clarity. No voices echoed.
Only breath, only awe. The world stretched before them like a canvas unpainted. Hills rose in the distance, cloaked in new growth.
The trees, once drowned, now reached again for the sun. Streams trickled quietly. The wind whispered through leaves that had never seen a storm. It was not a land of ruin. It was a land of rebirth. The animals, too, began to emerge. Two by two, as they had entered. They stepped out into the wild with gentle curiosity. Birds rose into the air, wings outstretched, as if remembering flight. Deer paused at the edge of tall grass, then walked forward with grace. The lions did not
roar. The lambs did not flee.
There was, for a time, peace among them, the kind of peace that follows obedience and surrender. Noah looked around, taking it all in. The sky above him was a vast dome of blue. The clouds were soft and slow-moving, and beneath it all, a new earth waited to be loved, to be tended, to be honored. It was not the same world that had been lost. That world had been swallowed by waters of grief. But this was something different. A beginning that had grown out of patience. Each footstep felt like a prayer. Not rushed, not careless. Each moment of movement was filled with gratitude. The land beneath them was not claimed, but received. Their journey was not one of conquest, but of communion. The world was quiet, and in that quiet, God was near. The ark left behind. After some time had passed, Noah turned back. The ark stood behind them, resting on the slopes of Ararat. Weathered, worn, yet strong. It had carried them through chaos, through judgment, through storm and silence. Its beams bore the memory of every prayer, every tear, every night wrapped in waiting. It had been their refuge, their shelter, carved from obedience. They stood as a family and looked upon it, not with sorrow but with reverence. The ark had been a vessel of mercy, a cradle floating on the breath of God. But now its purpose was fulfilled. It had served, and now it could rest. They would not live in it again. The ark had carried them to safety, but it was not meant to carry them forever. To leave the ark was to leave behind fear. To step into the new earth was to step into trust. The wooden walls had surrounded them like arms, but now they were being asked to let go. Not of God, but of the things he had used for a season, so they turned away, slowly, with soft hearts and steady feet. They did not rush. They did not forget. But they released what had held them, because something greater now called them forward. And as they walked away from the ark, the sun warmed their backs. The path ahead was unknown, but the one who had spoken the storm to sleep now led them in peace. The ark would remain a silent witness on the mountain, a reminder of God's faithfulness, a testimony carved in wood. But Noah and his family would not return to it. Their journey had begun again, not upon water, but upon earth. Not in hiding, but in light, the first altar. And then Noah stopped. In the quiet of that sacred earth, he knelt and began to gather stones. One by one he chose them, not the grandest, not the smoothest, but the ones his hands could carry. He stacked them gently, with care, not as a builder but as a worshipper. And there, before his family, before the animals, before the eyes of heaven, Noah built an altar. This was not a structure of defense. It was not for shelter. It was for
offering, for thanks, for remembrance. He did not speak many words. He did not perform a ritual.
He simply lit a fire upon the stones and let it burn. The smoke rose upward, soft, spiraling, slow. It carried no cries of fear, no smell of judgment, only the quiet scent of gratitude. The flames danced gently, not to destroy, but to bless. And in that rising smoke was the first prayer of the new world, a hymn of thanksgiving from the heart of a man who had listened, obeyed, and endured. God looked upon that offering. He received it not because it was elaborate, but because it was honest. It came not from ritual, but from reverence. In that moment, heaven and earth stood still. The altar was more than stone and flame. It was a bridge, a moment where creation, newly born, looked back to its creator and said, "Thank you." The family gathered around the altar. Their faces glowed with the light of fire and the light of peace. They were not afraid. They were not lost. They were found, anchored not in land or structure, but in God's presence. The first altar marked more than survival. It marked belonging. And from that altar, the world began again. Not with building, but with worship. The fire burned slowly as evening drew near. The sky deepened into soft purple and blue. The wind carried the scent of flame and forest. And in that quiet, sacred twilight, the new world exhaled its first praise. The altar stood as a promise that no matter what the world might become, it had started in thanksgiving. And there, under stars just beginning to shine, Noah closed his eyes. Not to sleep, but to rest. Not in fear, but in fulfillment. Around him, the earth was still. The altar was warm. And above him, God was near. Chapter 15. The Rainbow and the Covenant. The earth was quiet now, the storm had passed, the waters had fallen, and the sky no longer wept. In this soft stillness God spoke again, not through thunder, not in wind or flood, but in peace. His voice came as a whisper that stirred the soul, tender, clear, full of grace. Noah, kneeling before the altar, heard him not just with ears, but with the heart. It was the voice of the same God who had once shut the ark's door, and now opened the future. Never again, the Lord said, never again shall the waters become a flood to destroy all flesh. There was no anger in his words, no rebuke, only love. He spoke not as a distant ruler, but as a father making a promise. His words were steady, like rivers that would never overflow again. I make a covenant with you, he continued, a sacred vow not written in stone or sealed with fear, but spoken with compassion. Then he said something even more wondrous. I set my bow in the cloud. The language was simple, but the meaning was eternal. His bow, not a weapon, not an arrow, but a sign. A gentle arc stretched across the heavens, not pointed at man, but away from him. A symbol of peace, not war, of protection, not punishment. Noah lifted his eyes to the sky. Above him, the clouds had parted, and in their place came something never before seen. It was not lightning, it was not fire. It was light, bent and scattered through mist, woven into colors. It glowed with quiet majesty. Soft reds, deep violets, golden hues that shimmered like the robe of a king. The promise had not come in fear. It had come in beauty. This covenant was not made in secret. It was spoken in the open, beneath the wide heavens, before the eyes of creation. Every bird in the sky, every beast on the field, every child that would be born, all were included. And so, with this gentle word, a new chapter began. Not of wrath, but of mercy. Not of judgment, but of grace. And in the silence that followed, the world listened and was healed. The rainbow appears. The sky had been many things, heavy with storm, shrouded in rain, veiled in sorrow. But now, as the clouds gave way to sunlight, something new unfolded. Across the sky, from one end to the other, a curve of light began to form. It came not with noise, but with wonder. It appeared slowly like a breath, becoming visible. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. The colors did not fight for attention. They blended, each one humbling itself to make room for the next. Noah and his family stood still, their faces lifted, eyes wide with awe. The rainbow was not like the fire of the altar or the sparkle of stars. It was something different, softer, more tender. It did not blaze, it shimmered. It did not shout. It sang in silence the song of a promise. It stretched across the sky like a gentle bridge between heaven and earth. Not built by hands, not carved by stone, but painted in light by the hand of God Himself. Its presence was not a command, but a comfort. A sign not of what man had done, but of what God had chosen to do. It did not threaten, it invited. It called the soul to stillness, to reflection, to worship. Around the rainbow, the air seemed to hold its breath. The animals paused, The trees stood motionless, even the breeze softened, as if not wanting to disturb the sacred moment. Noah reached for his children's hands, and together they watched the covenant unfold in colors, not as spectators, but as witnesses. The rainbow marked not just the end of the flood, but the beginning of peace. It was the gentle hand of God, stretched across the heavens, reminding all who would look up that they were not forgotten, not abandoned. In every storm there would now be a sign, a light that followed darkness, a mercy that followed judgment, a grace that never faded. And though the rainbow faded in time, the promise it carried did not. It was not a fleeting moment. It was an eternal vow, one written not on scrolls, but on the sky. A bond that cannot break. This covenant was not small. It was not limited by time or nation or name. It was wide as the sky, deep as the sea, and lasting as the stars. God said, "This is the sign of the covenant I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all generations to come." It was not only Noah who received the promise. It was for the birds that flew above him, for the cattle that grazed near his feet, for the seeds buried in the soil, for the winds that carried pollen through the air. It was for every tree that would grow, for every mountain that would rise, for every child yet to be born. It was for all, and in that vast reach, the bond became unbreakable, not because of man's strength, but because of God's faithfulness. This was not a contract to be negotiated. It was not based on behavior, not measured by obedience. It was grace, pure and full. A one-sided promise made by a loving Creator to a fragile creation. God bound himself to this word, not because he needed to, but because he wanted to. Out of love, out of compassion, out of a desire to restore what had been broken. And the bow in the sky would be the reminder, not just for man, but for God himself. When I see the bow, he said, I will remember my covenant. The thought is gentle beyond words. The God who made the stars, who commands the seas, who names the winds, he would look upon a rainbow and remember mercy. Not because he forgets, but because he chooses to look upon his creation through the lens of compassion. And so the bond was made, not of stone, not of fire, but of promise. And that promise, resting in the curve of light above the world, would hold through every age. It would survive flood and famine, war and wandering, because it was held not by man's hands, but by God's heart. Memory in the sky time would pass. Seasons would change. Children would be born, and the earth would grow full again. Cities would rise, stories would unfold, and the memory of the flood would fade like mist. But the rainbow would return again and again. After every storm, when the skies grew still and the light returned, it would appear. It was not a thing to be touched. It could not be captured. Yet it remained faithful. It followed every rain, not in punishment, but in promise. Its arc reminded all who saw it that though storms come, they do not last forever, that even when the earth is shaken, God's love is not. For Noah's children, the rainbow became a story, a sacred memory painted in the sky. They would point and whisper, "That is the sign, that is the bow." And the story would be told, not as legend, but as covenant. They would remember how the world was washed clean, how mercy returned with the dove, how the altar burned with thanks, and how God stretched his love from one end of heaven to the other, and so the rainbow became more than a sight. It became a silence, a softness, a signpost in the soul. In every age it spoke the same truth, that judgment may come, but mercy is greater. That God may discipline, but he also restores. That the sky, though once a source of fear, is now a canvas for grace. In the days to come, as people walked through valleys or stood atop hills, they would look up after the rain and see it curved, holy, peaceful. They would stop. They would breathe. They would remember. The rainbow would become a holy memory, a promise drawn in light, a declaration that love endures. And though the storms would come again, though thunder might roll and clouds might
gather, they would not destroy, for the rainbow would always follow. And in that bow, God's people would find rest, a reminder that they were never alone, that heaven still watched.
That mercy still covered the sky. The chapter closed not with fear, but with quiet peace. The rainbow faded slowly, gently, returning to where it came from, not vanishing, but waiting. Waiting for the next storm to end. Waiting to appear once
more. Waiting to remind the world that God had spoken, and his word would never pass away.
Chapter 16. A World Made New. The floodwaters were gone, but their memory lingered in the soft hush of the earth. The land, once drowned and lifeless, now exhaled quietly beneath the open sky. Where torrents had once raged, now came stillness, and in that stillness something sacred stirred. A beginning. Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, looked across the vast terrain and saw not ruin, but readiness. The soil was dark and rich, untouched by human hands, yet shaped by the breath
of heaven. With careful movements and quiet reverence, they bent low to the ground.
Their hands met the earth, not with haste, but with awe. Seeds were placed gently, not scattered in pride, but in prayer. They planted not only for food, but for the future, for children yet unborn, for trees that would one day offer shade, for vines that would one day wrap around homes yet unbuilt. Each row of planted grain felt like a hymn. The rhythm of digging and sowing was more than labor. It was worship. With every seed buried in the softened ground, they remembered the flood, and they praised the one who had brought them through it. The land, once sealed by water, now welcomed roots. Shoots of green pierced the soil, rising slowly like prayers.
Answered in silence. The foundations of life began again, not with cities or towers, but with gardens and fields.
Noah watched his sons with gratitude, their silhouettes bathed in morning light as they worked in unity. They did not speak much, for the land was sacred. Every breeze that passed carried the scent of new beginnings. Every crack in the soil held the promise of mercy. This was not the same world as before, yet it was not lost. The Creator who had washed the earth clean now whispered through every leaf, "Grow again." And so they obeyed, and the land, bathed in God's kindness, opened wide to receive their care. Children of the ark. As the days passed and the crops reached upward toward the sun, laughter returned to the hills. It began softly, a giggle, a shout, a song, and then grew like firelight in the dusk. The children of Shem, Ham, and Japheth ran freely through the fields their fathers had planted. Their feet touched ground that had never known war. Their voices echoed through trees that had never heard sorrow. They chased one another between stones warmed by the sun, played in the shadows of sprouting fig trees, and rested in the tall grass, where birds sang again. Their joy was unmeasured, pure and unbroken, for they had not known the waters of the flood. To them, the world was simply alive, wide, green, and full of wonder. And yet, even in their play, there was something holy, for every step they took upon the earth was an answer to prayer. They were the children of the ark, living proof that God's promise endured. Their very presence was a testimony that life had not ended, but had been reborn. The elders watched them with soft eyes. They saw in their movements the restoration of rhythm, the return of peace. Where once silence had filled the ark's corridors, now songs of children rose toward heaven. Their games were not just moments of delight, they were signs of hope. This came. Parents built homes from timber, raised walls with care, and shaped hearths that would warm the coming years. They worked with love, and they taught their children gently, not only how to plant, or build, or tend, but how to walk with reverence upon the land. For this land, given back by God, was not to be taken lightly. So the children ran and laughed and learned, and with every step, the new world received them, not as intruders, but as welcome guests. The lessons remembered. As the seasons turned and trees bore fruit, the elders gathered their little ones by the firelight and began to speak. Their voices were not hurried. Their words were slow, shaped by memory, softened by reverence. The children leaned close, their eyes wide, their hands still. These were not just stories. These were sacred remembrances. Noah told them of the ark, how it had been built, plank by plank, in faith and obedience. He spoke of the animals, of the long nights, of the sound of rain that had not ceased. His voice trembled, not from fear, but from reverence. He spoke not to frighten, but to teach. He told them how God had spoken, how God had warned, and how God had saved. Shem shared how the waters had swallowed mountains, and how they had waited day after day for the dove to return. He told of the olive leaf, small and green, yet heavier with meaning than any crown. Ham remembered how the sun first touched their faces when the door of the ark opened again. How the world smelled new. How the first altar had been built, not from fear, but from thanks. Japheth, in his quiet voice, reminded them of the rainbow, how it had appeared in the sky, not in anger, but as a bow of peace, a sign that God had made a covenant with all of creation, a promise that still lingered in every storm's wake. They did not speak of the flood to keep the past alive, but to keep God's mercy remembered. The children listened, and though they had never seen the ark, they carried it in their hearts. They learned that the world was not simply a place to live, but a gift to care for. That God's word was not just to be read, but lived, and that every rainbow in the sky was not only beautiful, it was sacred. In the hush that followed each story, the fire crackled softly, and the children would look upward beyond the trees, into the sky where the stars now sang of mercy. Echoes of Eden, the world was not as it once was. Eden, that first garden of perfect peace, was still behind a veil. The path to its gates remained guarded, but something of its spirit whispered through this new land. The streams, though smaller, still flowed with clarity. The trees, though young, reached for heaven with their leaves. The animals moved with peace, each one a silent participant in God's covenant. And as the families walked through fields and forests, they walked not in fear, but in fellowship. There was no serpent here,
Only the memory of redemption.
the people had been spared, not because they were strong, but because they were chosen. And in that choosing, they found not pride, but humility. Noah often walked alone in the early morning, his feet quiet upon the dew-soaked grass. He watched the sun rise with eyes that remembered rain. He breathed deeply of air that no longer held judgment. He touched leaves that had once been swallowed by flood. Though Eden had been lost, it had not been erased. In every bloom, in every bird, in every newborn child's cry, there was an echo of that first garden, not perfect, but present, not untouched, but redeemed. And where love grew, in laughter, in labor, in learning, God walked again, not in a visible form, but in presence, in the breeze that cooled the day, in the warmth that touched the skin, in the peace that wrapped around hearts like a soft cloak. The world was still wounded, but it was not forsaken. And in every act of kindness, in every offering of thanks, Eden stirred again. A whisper of the beginning, carried into the new, a world made not only by God's power, but held by His mercy. And so the people lived, not perfectly, but purposefully, planting, praying, remembering, knowing that God, who had once cleansed the earth, now walked among them again, not with sword, but with grace, not with wrath, but with love. In every sunrise they saw a beginning, and in every rainbow they remembered a God who keeps His word, forever faithful, forever near. Chapter 17. The Legacy of the Three Sons. The flood had passed, the waters that once covered the face of the earth had drawn back, and the world had begun again, tender, fresh, and wide with silence. From the base of Mount Ararat, where the ark had come to rest, the sons of Noah began to walk outward. Shem, Ham, and Japheth, 3 sons of one man, 3 roots from one tree, now moved in different directions, called by the hand of providence, to fill the earth once more. They did not leave in haste. Their steps were thoughtful, measured like a prayer. The land, though cleansed, was unfamiliar. Yet their hearts carried the memory of the flood, the voice of God, and the promise of the hour rainbow. Each son had his own path, his own people to tend, but all bore the same beginning. Shem moved eastward. His eyes looked for rivers and valleys, for places where wisdom could dwell. His people would become shepherds and scribes, their tents filled with stories, their scrolls heavy with remembrance. Ham turned to the south. He followed the warmth of the sun, where the soil was dark and rich. His children built with stone, carved with skill, and learned to gather fruit from the vine. Japheth wandered toward the open west and north. He sought the coastlines, the wide plains, and the distant forests. His people would grow in number, stretching across lands still unnamed, their hands strong and their hearts curious. They spoke new words now. They clothed themselves in different patterns and dyed their garments with colors from the land. Their homes changed from tents to wooden halls, from campfires to hearths of brick and stone. But no matter where they settled or what tongue they spoke, the roots ran deep. They all came from one ark, from one family, from one mercy. And as they walked into their own stories, they carried the same truth. The world had been judged, but it had also been redeemed. And they, sons of Noah, were living proof that life had found its way forward again. The seeds of many nations, the world grew wide with footsteps, from small firesides where elders whispered stories to rising walls of new cities. The children of Shem, Ham, and Japheth began to shape nations. But before they built towers or traded goods, they built memories passed down in the quiet rhythms of daily life. Villages sprang up beside rivers, nestled near hills, tucked under canopies of forest. The people planted gardens, tended sheep, and sang to their children the songs their fathers had sung. Stories flowed like rivers, not written in stone yet, but spoken in warmth and wonder. They told of a flood that had swallowed the mountains, of a man who had built an ark with trembling
hands, of a dove that brought a leaf, and of a bow in the sky that wrapped the heavens in peace. Around these stories, nations grew.
Some grew strong with trade, others with wisdom, still others with harvest. But at the center of them all was the seed of remembrance, that they had come from one place, saved by one God, cradled in one vessel of mercy. Even as they learned new crafts and adopted new customs, echoes of the past lived on in their bones. They remembered the rains not to stir fear, but to honor the hand that had stilled them. They remembered the ark not as a myth, but as a memory. Their walls bore carvings of birds and trees. Their songs mentioned waters and stars. And in the eyes of the old, there was still a softness, a quiet awe for what had been. From those tents and firesides, the world widened, and the names of their children became the names of tribes and peoples. But the story remained one. Spoken differently, colored by different lands, yet always returning to the same truth, that all had come from mercy. That every nation, great or small, had begun with one family saved by grace. Family beneath the stars. Though they had spread far across the land, there were nights when the family gathered again. When the sky was clear and the wind carried familiar scents, Shem, Ham, and Japheth would return to the place where the ark had rested, and they would sit with their father, Noah, beneath the stars that had once watched the flood. Their tents were set in a circle and fires were lit, not just for warmth, but for memory. The children played nearby, their laughter mingling with the crackle of firewood. The women prepared food with care, and the men shared stories with hands outstretched. It was a quiet celebration, not loud, but holy. Shem would often bring a flute carved from cedar. He would sit near the flames and play the melodies of old. Songs from before the flood, songs from the ark, songs of hope and waiting. His music drifted through the camp like mist, soft and sacred. Japheth, wide-eyed and weathered from travels, would speak of the lands he had seen, of coastlines where waves spoke a different tongue, of forests where animals walked with quiet pride. His words painted pictures of the world's beauty, always ending in awe. Ham, joyful and full of life, would share news of his people, the fruits they had grown, the tools they had crafted, the new songs they sang. His stories carried the scent of rain-washed fields and sun-warmed stone. But when Noah spoke, the camp fell still. He would look up, his eyes reflecting the starlight, and begin to speak slowly. Not of cities, not of trade, but of the day the world was washed clean. He would tell of the silence on the water, the birds that flew without rest, the door that had opened at last. And always he ended by pointing to the stars. These stars, he would say, were the same that shone when the ark floated on the waters. They watched us then. They watch us still. And above them, God watches too. The family would sit in silence, warmed by fire, wrapped in peace. For though the world had grown wide, their hearts were still close. Beneath the sky that had seen the flood, they remembered who they were. One family blessed by grace. One blood, many paths. Time carried them forward, each to their own lands. The children grew into leaders, the villages into nations, the stories into legends. Roads were built, borders were drawn, languages deepened and changed. But even as the paths diverged, one truth remained. They were one blood. They did not always live close, but their bond ran deeper than distance. They did not always speak the same words, but their hearts held the same song. The ark no longer stood upon the mountain, but it lived in memory. A vessel not of wood, but of witness. In the marketplaces and mountains, in valleys and along riverbanks, their descendants would pause at the sight of rain clouds and look upward when the rainbow returned. And whether they called God by different names or knelt in different ways, something deep within remembered that before any kingdom was built, they had been family. That before any throne or crown, there was a boat on the water, holding them close in mercy. The world grew loud, but the memory stayed quiet, tucked into the corners of hearts, passed down in lullabies and whispered in prayer. The flood had scattered them across the earth, but it had also sealed them in unity. One judgment, one rescue, one beginning. And though the generations would walk many paths, across deserts and oceans, through forests and fields, they would never walk alone. The God who had saved Noah watched over every step. The bow in the sky still curved above them all, and the stars, high and steady, still told the story of how mercy came through water. So they lived, each in their own land, each in their own way, but bound together by something greater than blood, bound by the memory of the ark, bound by the promise of the rainbow, bound by the voice that once said, "Come out," a voice that still echoed across the earth, calling them not just to remember, but to remain one.